let's touch grass and chat about why geography is the secret hero of East Asian history. First of all, disclaimer here. Based on what kind of historian you are or what class you're taking, the post-classical era can start from anywhere around 800 to about 1200 CE. If you're taking AP World History, though, the post-classical era starts at the year 1200. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't know things that happened before 1200, but it does mean you won't be directly tested on it. So yeah, small mercies. Anyway, East Asia is huge, and it goes without saying, involves much more than just China. Even so, China did play a huge role in the development of other East Asian dynasties and empires. So if you only have the brain power to remember one country out of each region, then, well, I guess China would be the one to know for East Asia. It was called the Middle Kingdom for a reason, after all. The others are still cool and worth knowing for their own sakes, though. So here are some regional takeaways. As a region, a big thing to know about East Asia was that its people were constantly in motion. Nobody was locked behind castle walls like in Europe. Empires competed for dominance, shared religions, traded stuff, and raced to perfect new technologies. So this is where geography comes into play. Geography is much more than that quiz you take at the beginning of the unit where your teacher takes off half a point because you forgot to capitalize the G in Gobi Desert. It's literally the reason people settled where they did, why they traveled where they did, and fought for the resources another place had. So take Japan. Japan is a collection of islands, which meant that China could not simply march an army across the border whenever it wanted. Even the people of Japan wouldn't unify all of their islands together until about 1868. So yeah, the Chinese, without the advantage of being right there, would kind of struggle with that. Not quite possible to breathe down their neighbor's neck, insisting Japan becoming a vassal state, creepy like. The Sea of Japan and the East China Sea gave Japan a natural barrier against those kinds of creeps and, against invasions, but it was still close enough to allow for some interactions with their neighbors. Mostly on Japan's terms. So Japan got to be picky and borrowed Buddhism, Confucianism, writing systems, and all kinds of other Chinese ideas, but they kept their own language, political system, and culture. So a cool story about this is when the Koreans sent the Mongols after the Japanese, like a kid snitching to their mom. Like, if you're trying to build a tribute empire, those guys over there aren't paying tribute to you either. And the Mongols were like, yeah, that makes sense. How dare they exist beyond our rule? So, Mongol and Korean officials were sent to Japan 6 separate times to demand the Japanese just accept the Mongols as their rulers. And the Japanese gave the post-classical version of, "New phone, who dis?" It was bad enough that the officials complained that they weren't allowed into the Japanese capital. Their living quarters were poor quality, the entertainment sucked, and there was intense disrespect. Kublai Khan, the head of the Mongols at the time, was enraged into leading 2 separate, unsuccessful invasions. There is a myth that the gods themselves protected Japan through tsunamis, repelling the invaders, which led to the term kamikaze, or divine wind. But, that's historically been proven to be an exaggeration. There were storms, but angry samurai also helped to defend Japan. Now, speaking of islands and advantages, let's chat about Korea. Korea, controlled by Goryeo Empire, found a very different take on the Mongol problem. When the Mongols invaded in the 1200s, the Goryeo Empire and court did not just, hunker down in the capital and hope for the best. They moved their entire capital to Ganghwa Island. Ganghwa wasn't just an island. It was probably the most heavily defended place on the Korean peninsula. The royal court moved there. Government officials moved there. A lot of the military moved there. The land was fertile enough to support a large population, and while the Mongols devastated much of mainland Korea, the political heart of the kingdom still remained intact. In fact, one of Korea's greatest cultural achievements, the Tripitaka Koreana, was actually carved during this period. Just think about that. While there was a whole invasion raging across the mainland, Korea still had enough stability, skilled labor, and resources to undertake one of the largest woodblock printing projects in world history. And now when you hear island, you're probably imagining something way out in the ocean that takes hours to reach by boat. Or maybe a small piece of land surrounded by, sharks or something. No. At low tide, you can literally walk towards Ganghwa across enormous mud flats. Imagine the world's biggest mud puddles, like the kind that suck your shoes off when you try to walk through them. Yup. When the tide or water was low, it was just sticky, mud, wetland. And that is exactly what made it such a nightmare to attack. Imagine you're one of the greatest armies in history. Your entire military strategy revolves around speed, mobility, and archers on horseback. Now imagine trying to charge across ankle-deep mud while defenders make it rain arrows from heavily fortified walls. Now, suddenly, the world's greatest cavalry doesn't look quite so terrifying. The Mongols were never able to successfully take over Ganghwa, despite attempts to invade it. After a while, they just repeatedly demanded that the Koryo court to move back to the old capital. But the royal court basically played safety tag, where they would send the military off the island to fight the Mongols for a bit, rile them up, and then retreat back to the safety of the island, where the Mongols were pretty much powerless to follow. Well, what about the people not on the island? Well, less lucky. More like massacred, pillaged, the whole shebang. They put up a good fight when they could, such as the monk who shot a Mongol commander in the head with an arrow. But yeah. Eventually the Koreans got tired of fighting the Mongols after about 30 years of warfare and signed a peace treaty, but still, pretty big achievement due to the power of mud and geography. Now let's compare that to Vietnam. Just spoiler alert. Vietnam is not a peninsula, nor is it an island. Actually, Vietnam also wasn't really a thing yet. It was split into Dai Viet in the north and the Champa Kingdom in the south. Yes, take a moment. Shout out Champa rice, I'll wait for you. Get it out of your system. Now, Dai Viet shared a land border with China, which sounds terrible if your neighbor is the biggest empire on the planet. But Dai Viet had a secret advantage. Mountains. Dense, rugged mountains. Good luck getting an army up and down this thing kind of mountain range. But yeah, on multiple occasions, forces from China, first the Mongols and later the Ming dynasty, they tried to invade them. However, the Vietnamese knew the terrain and repeatedly lured the Mongols and later the Ming forces into ambushes. So, on paper, army for army, Dai Viet and even Champa might appear to have zero chance at winning against the Mongols or against the Ming dynasty. However, because of geography, they were able to fight back. The Ming dynasty would control Dai Viet for about 20 years, but General Lai Loi led Lam Song uprising, ultimately forcing the Chinese army to withdraw in 1428 and reestablishing the Vietnamese kingdom. Guys, you have no idea how big of a deal this was. Think King Arthur level of mythology and replace it with Lai Loi being a Like, he was given a magical sword with the power to change fate by a golden turtle who lives deep beneath the waters of Hankiem Lake. You cannot make this up. Well, I mean, except for the fact that obviously magical turtles aren't real. Sorry to burst your bubble. But Lê Lợi is the reason Vietnam was recognized as an independent territory and established the Lê dynasty that lasted until almost the 20th century. So, score one for the underdogs. Because of geography. Now, last but not least, China. Yay! Now, everyone remembers the Great Wall of China, but one of China's greatest engineering achievements was not built to keep people out. It was built to move stuff around. I am, of course, speaking of the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal connected the rich farming regions of southern China to the political and military centers in the north. Imagine trying to feed one of the largest populations on Earth without trucks, trains, or highways. Yeah. The North certainly regularly dealt with starvation and famine until they had regular shipments of rice. Yes, including champa rice. All from the South. So the canal became China's economic highway centuries before highways existed there. Like, okay, side note, big exception, the Incas had highways down pat, but that's in South America, not East Asia. Back to this. Anyway, the Grand Canal also linked up major sections of China into one big area that could be more easily taxed and managed by Chinese rulers. So, aside from the Grand Canal connecting all of the areas that were waterway accessible, the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts helped shape China's defenses and transportation too. They acted like big natural borders, limiting Chinese expansion, while also separating China from nomadic peoples of the steppe, including the Mongols, for a while. So there's an ocean, 2 deserts, some mountains, and a huge expansive empire. Yikes. Bureaucratic nightmare. So much paperwork. So to keep all of this hunk of empire connected, the Mongols under the Yuan dynasty invented a postal system called the Yam. They carried a shiny metal They carried a shiny metal object that acted like an ID and a passport. If they were delivering something, and a peasant just so happened to be passing by, the peasant was legally required to give their horse to the delivery guy. So, congratulations, not your horse anymore. Anyway, why did I just yap your ears off about East Asian geography for so long? Well, it's because it leads in today's AP tip. If you ever get stuck on an LEQ or a DBQ, just go on a tangent about geography. Geography is background contextualizing info, which can count for sourcing. Easy point. Don't talk about where stuff is located, but instead write through the lens of how did being here change what happened, or how did it influence the people who lived there? Geography and history show the possibilities and limitations of people who lived in the past. Anyway, we've touched enough grass for today, so Romeo and I are out. Peace!